And I just want to say a few words by way of introduction to the topic. I became interested in Soviet dissidents because I wanted to understand how people who live in authoritarian societies, non-democratic societies, think about their political options, the way they imagine what the possibilities are for political engagement in an environment that is not hospitable to that kind of activity, to put it mildly. And I also wanted to know about which people not only think about options, but decide to act on them, and how they do so. My own training in Imperial Russian and Soviet history naturally led me to that country as my case study. And that's where I did the lion's share of the research in archives and other repositories. Although, as I quickly discovered, because so many of the dissidents had been expelled from the Soviet Union, their papers followed wherever they went. So the dissident diaspora also formed my research terrain, which took me to Europe, to Israel, to various spots in the United States. I also had in the back of my mind that the Soviet Union was not a unique case for this question of how people in authoritarian societies think about political engagement. And at the time I was writing the book, I thought, well, surely this will shed some light on today's Russia under Putin, today's China, today's Iran, perhaps today's North Korea. But I didn't even imagine, when I submitted the manuscript to my publisher in the summer of 2023, is that my own country would slowly join this list where people started to think, what are my options for political engagement under an increasingly authoritarian political structure? I am alive to all of the crucial differences between all of these examples that I've mentioned, but the book took on a resonance that honestly I never anticipated, a resonance in the United States. And I suppose it has benefited from that a bit in terms of the attention that it's gotten. That was certainly mentioned at the Pulitzer ceremony, but I want to emphasize that was the furthest thing from my mind when I was writing it. And it's just another example of how writing a book is like giving birth to a baby and sending it out into the world. You just don't know what's going to happen to it and what it's going to become. But that's the way I feel about this particular book. So thank you all again for coming and for braving the elements. This is a great turnout in a great location, and I'm very happy to be here with you.
So let me begin by saying what an honor it is to engage in this conversation with you. I regularly tell people that your book is one of my favorite books that I've read in many, many, many years. And this is the first time that we've met, and so for me to be able to have a chat with you in this wonderful bookstore is really quite an honor. And one of the reasons I tell people to read your book is, as someone who watches China, I kept underlining your book in places where I saw these parallels with the People's Republic of China. So you write about how this remarkable woman, Natalia Gorbanovskaya, who actually has a song written about her by Joan Baez, one of the reasons she became such a prominent dissident was because of the guilt that she felt because of what she told the regime about her associates when she protested the crackdown in Hungary in 1956. And it made me think of Liu Xiaobo. One of the reasons he took his actions in China so seriously was because of what he wrote when he was imprisoned after June 4, this letter of repentance. Also, we see in the Chinese dissident movement this sense that whether you went to jail and how much time you spent in jail and the level of suffering that you experienced was somehow related to your credentials within the movement. We see a lot of factionalism, both within the Soviet dissidents, also within the Chinese dissident movement. Among Chinese dissidents, we also see, like we saw in the Soviet Union, these tensions between decentralization and hierarchy, spontaneity and leadership. We also see debates in both countries about whether principle is the key element, whether that the act of being a dissident is about a moral struggle, it's about saving your own soul, or whether your choices should be more shaped by the effect that it will have in terms of political outcomes. We also see in both cases the role of friendship, whether you sign a particular petition, whether you participate in a particular movement. A lot of it has to do with whether your old buddy comes and says that it's the right thing. And also, I think one of the more striking similarities too is in both sides we see a debate about whether opposing the regime is creating pressures for them to somehow mimic the regime, whether defeating the regime demands a sense of struggle mindset and hatred and lack of forgiveness, or whether actually defeating the regime also requires a whole different approach to politics entirely. And then looking on the other side, the regime itself, right? There are these amazing similarities between Xi Jinping today and what we saw in the Soviet Union. One is that what we see both in China today and during the Brezhnev period is, on the one hand, they take pride that they're not like what it was like under Stalin and Mao. They say, well, if this was just a few years ago, you can't imagine what we would be doing to you, right? But at the same time, they still talk a lot about class struggle and the need to defeat enemies. And this dilemma is one that they struggle with. They can't really seem to figure out what the right balance is here, right? If we're not using violence, but what exactly are we doing if we're moving in a new direction, right? And the other is that in both cases, these dissidents, they're not breaking the law, but the regime still worries about them. And in fact, in a way, the regime wishes they would break the law because then it would be easier to hurt them. And in both Chinese and Soviet documents, we see that they think ideology is the problem, right? But having a different view of the world is not technically a crime in either of these countries. And so what you do is see these extrajudicial means, like bringing someone to tea or having a conversation, prophylactica in the Russian word, or hecha in Chinese, which they both get to the same place, which is quite remarkable. There's also this preoccupation with the youth. This idea that both in the Soviet Union and China, the West is using sex, consumerism, materialism, religion, and so these youth are not motivated by real problems within these societies, but that the West is really putting them up to it. They also, in both cases, seem to dither between persecution and co-optation, and so they seem strangely feckless in many occasions, where they're not sure whether it's better to hurt someone and look bad, or whether to try to co-opt someone but then possibly let them continue at large and create problems for them. And finally, the arc is quite striking, where in both cases, after the deaths of Stalin and Mao, both countries allow more space. And in both cases, you see attempts to use the rule of law to mean what it says on paper. And then they decide in both cases that not even that is allowable. Which leads me to my first question, which is, would it have been possible in the Soviet Union for a different trajectory, where these small attempts at incrementalism, these small attempts at trying to make the regime appreciate the rule of law could have led to a different kind of Soviet Union, where this openness was still allowed, and that they would see a value in allowing people to blow off steam in this particular way? Or, to use the words of Stephen Kotkin, that you can't be half communist and you can't be half pregnant, that this trajectory was inevitable because a communist regime simply can't allow that kind of openness in society, because they're right that if you allow that kind of openness, you never know when it's going to go too far.
I'm not a big fan of inevitability arguments, that things happened because they had to happen. And if anything, for me, one of the more profound lessons of some of the dissident protests is the message that even in the darkest, least promising, most hopeless situations, there is always room for moral choice of some kind. There are always options in front of people. They might not be the ideal options, but there are always choices to be made. And I think the same is true of history writ large. The puzzle in, I think, the Russian/Soviet case is that if we widen the angle of perception beyond just the years after Stalin's death and what opportunities were open, which had already been essentially foreclosed by the structure of Bolshevism itself, if we widen the aperture and ask, what about Russian history writ large? What about this seemingly inexorable pattern of always returning to a highly person-centered form of power, highly concentrated power, and largely authoritarian power? You know, it happened after the revolution of 1905. It happened after the revolution of 1917. It happened after the liberalization that occurred during the Second World War, when lots and lots of control had to be relinquished for the existential purpose of defeating Nazi Germany and salvaging the Soviet Union as a country. It happened after 1991. What is it about that society that seems to take authoritarian forms of power as the default setting? And are they locked into that cycle permanently? Well, permanently is a long time, and I don't like to use always or never as historical categories. So my answer to your question is there absolutely was wiggle room for greater openness. And in fact, during the so-called thaw era under Khrushchev, one of the great questions, one of the great puzzles of the day was exactly how wide is that opening going to be? And if you read documents from that period, whether they're from the state apparatus or from politically connected people or even ordinary Soviet citizens, what you see is that nobody had an answer to that puzzle. People were working it out in real time. It's true that Khrushchev was forced from office in October of 1964 in a kind of peaceful palace coup. But there are two things, and he was replaced by people who wanted to tighten the realm of free speech to the extent that it had opened up a little bit under Khrushchev. But there are two things to note. The first is Khrushchev was not removed from power because there was too much free speech in the Soviet Union. He was removed from power because his policies were so erratic, and in the case of his foreign policy and the humiliation of the Cuban Missile Crisis, made the Soviet Union look bad and weak in a way that his comrades in the Politburo could no longer tolerate. But the main problem that led to his ousting was not what he did domestically, the things that we associate with the thaw. The other thing I think that's worth noting about that particular episode of retightening the circle of what's permissible is that the way Khrushchev was removed from power was itself a barometer of how successful he was in distancing the Soviet Union from its Stalinist legacy. Because if he had been removed from power the way they did things under Stalin, he would have been taken to the basement of the Lubyanka prison at KGB headquarters in Moscow and shot. But he wasn't. They conjured up a story about his ill health, and they removed him from power for the sake of preserving his health, but he was given a generous pension, and he lived out his days in his dacha outside of Moscow. And to give you an idea of how un-Stalinist his last chapters were, he was able to write his memoirs and smuggle them out of the Soviet Union. And they were translated by Strobe Talbot and published in the West in English and German and French and other languages under the title Khrushchev Remembers. If this had happened under Stalin, not only would Khrushchev not have written his memoirs, he wouldn't have been remembering anything because he would have been dead on the spot. So ironically, the very technique of Khrushchev's removal signals something about what really had changed. So I do resist these inevitability arguments and the notion that there can be no compromise. There are limits, of course, to what a government like the Soviet government was capable not only of doing, but of imagining about itself and the country that it governed. But unlike pregnancy, it's not an on or off switch in my mind, with all due respect to Steve Kotkin.
So the next question I'd like to ask about is, you describe people with Jewish heritage among the dissident movement, you describe scientists among the dissident movement, and you look at reasons for why they were well represented in that community. And you also talk about, and I'll use a term that's typically referred to in the Chinese case, but could be referred to in the Soviet case, princelings, right? And so you describe individuals like Yakir, whose father was a general who yelled, "Long live Stalin," as he was facing execution. And when Stalin heard about it, he said that he was a bastard, according to Khrushchev, at least.
That's the polite version of what Stalin said.
Right. And then Yakir becomes a very prominent dissident, and he's not the only one. Two grandchildren of Litvinov also are dissidents, the son of Bukharin, and it makes me wonder whether you could also go into more detail about that phenomenon, right? And in a way it's not surprising, because what these Soviet princelings, for lack of a better term, witnessed was how the party hurt their parents, how the party made their parents hurt other people, and the moral degradation of what that meant, right? And how it sullied their parents, and how their parents lived lives that were essentially a lie. And what's interesting is these princelings also thought about it in generational terms, such as, I want to be able to look my own children in the eye, right? And so I'm curious, how widespread was this phenomenon, and do you have any other thoughts on this that I didn't bring up here?
My understanding of the Chinese use of the term princelings refer to the offspring, often but not always male, of important leaders of the Communist Party in China who are placed in positions of power and influence solely because of their lineage. Whether it's on the board of a company where they can, rake in the money, or a politically important position. And of course, you wrote the biography of the father of the most successful princeling of all, someone who rose to the very apex of the political system.
You guessed why I'm asking this question.
The Soviet case is a little more diffuse. So I'll just take a couple of the examples that you mentioned. So Pavel Litvinov, who I'm proud to call my friend, he's still alive and lives outside New York City. He was one of the 8 participants in a demonstration in Red Square on August 25th, 1968, against the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia that had happened 4 days earlier. He was the grandson of Maxim Litvinov, who was Stalin's first Commissar of Foreign Affairs. So this is a very high Bolshevik lineage. And Pavel Litvinov grew up in a building called the House of Government, which is this enormous apartment building where the nomenklatura, the elite of the elite in the Soviet system, had their abode, they and their spouses and their children. There's a wonderful book about the House of Government by that very name by Yuri Slozkin, one of the great historians of the Soviet Union. But Litvinov, first of all, it skips a generation. Litvinov's father, Mikhail Litvinov, was not really prominent in any way. He was not even a member of the Communist Party. And I have never heard from Pavel Litvinov, either in things that he wrote at the time or in my conversations with him since, that he was in any way ashamed of his grandfather. If only because his grandfather was, at a certain point, sacked by Stalin. It didn't look good to have a Jewish foreign minister when you were trying to negotiate with Adolf Hitler for a non-aggression treaty. So Stalin replaced Litvinov with the Slavic Molotov. So the sense of shame or of Oedipal revolt against the father's or mother's sometimes generation is not obvious in Litvinov's case. And another example that I think fits the rubric that you're describing was one of the most outspoken dissidents of all, died a few years ago in exile in England, named Vladimir Bukovsky. And Bukovsky was a real contrarian, a real fighter. And he did, at one point, become appalled at what his parents had done in the 1930s. They were not high party officials, they were journalists. His father was a member of the Writers' Union. Father came from very humble origins, son of peasants, not terribly well educated. In fact, his father was a poster boy for the Soviet system, which took enormous pride in elevating the sons and daughters of workers and peasants to white-collar positions, to positions of responsibility and some degree of power in the new Soviet state. But in the larger scheme of things, Bukovsky's father was not a major official, and Bukovsky could in no way be called a princeling. What was very powerful in Bukovsky's mind was the shame that his parents had reproduced state propaganda about how wonderful things were in the 1930s, that they had remained silent about the famine in Ukraine and Kazakhstan that took 3.9 million lives. That's a low estimate. I'm trying to be conservative. So you don't have to be a princeling to have grave doubts about what your parents did, and also, as you rightly said, to develop the moral sensibility in yourself that I will never do something that I cannot talk to my children about. And I would rather be able to speak to my children honestly, not only about what I did, but what I knew and when I knew it, than to cover things up the way Bukowski's parents had. So I think in some ways the Chinese example is more pronounced. It's more dramatic. In the Soviet case, the generations can be extended from 1 to 2. The genders are also, in a sense, very flexible. There are daughters. There are grandmothers who are Bolsheviks that people become ashamed of. So it's a more diffuse phenomenon, but nonetheless, I think the family drama is a key engine in explaining why some people become dissidents. And if I may, you mentioned at the beginning of that question the preponderance of people from what we would now call the STEM fields in this movement. Really striking proportion of the dissidents were professionally trained in engineering or physics or mathematics or what we would now call computer science, and back then it was cybernetics or information theory. It's really, if you just spend a little bit of time looking at the biographies, you'll be struck by this. And if you spend a little bit more time and actually read the memoirs and the biographies, you'll be struck by how many of them came from Jewish families. Families where at least one, sometimes both parents were Jewish. And almost inescapably, one of the questions I was trying to answer when I started this project was, how can we account for those people who became active in this movement? What is it about their biographies that can help explain that phenomenon? And people who have thought about this before I did would often invoke, let's say, the scientific worldview and the culture of open exchange and debate among scientists, not only in the Soviet Union, which hosted a world-class body of scientists, especially in physics and math, but globally, a kind of cosmopolitan conversation about the great scientific issues of the day. Isn't it the case that those habits of mind help explain why so many dissidents had scientific backgrounds? They were applying their intellectual training to the political dilemmas of their own time. Well, it's an appealing theory. It makes the scientists very appealing as individuals. The problem, as I discovered, is that the overwhelming majority of Soviet scientists never became dissidents. In fact, were rather standoffish, if not outright hostile, to the dissident movement, and they had the exact same scientific training. They were no different in that respect. And some very, very distinguished Soviet scientists, including a number of Nobel laureates, wanted nothing to do with the dissident movement. So for every Andrei Sakharov, the Nobel laureate who invented the Soviet hydrogen bomb, there were 6 others at an equal level of world-class scientific discovery who did no such thing, had absolutely nothing to do with the dissident movement. And similarly, the overwhelming majority of the Jewish population of the Soviet Union, which was never more than about 3% of the total Soviet population, the overwhelming majority of Soviet Jews not only didn't join the movement, but wanted nothing to do with it because of how dangerous it was, and in many people's minds, how naive it was, how unrealistic it was about the possibilities for reforming the system. So that was a real struggle for me when I was working on this project.
That is another similarity that I could have mentioned at the beginning of my remarks, that in the Chinese case, you would see figures like Xu Liangyin and Wang Ganchang, who was a pivotal individual in China's nuclear weapons program, who were signing these petitions calling for quicker reform. But as you said, right, you can see how for some people these scientific values would facilitate a more reflective view of the government, but that did not mean that for the majority. And that, as you said, and as you write about in your book, in the Soviet case, many of these scientists actually were upset with people like Sakharov because they were forced to condemn Sakharov, which made them even more complicit in the regime, that even if they were had certain things they didn't like about it, they didn't want to be put into a position of affirming it by going after people like Sakharov. Which that brings me to another, I think, enduring feature of the dissident movements, which is they have to decide not just what it means for themselves to make these decisions, but what it means for their families and for their friends. And so It really takes a particular kind of individual. And I'd like to ask you also about this term dissident. And I've heard you give talks where you discuss why that particular term is somewhat problematic. And when you describe so-called dissidents in the Soviet Union, one of the things that really jumps out at me is how they were still believers in core elements of the Soviet system, right? That there was this idea that the Soviet Union could be saved. And they didn't even really think about economics that much, which kind of surprised me a little bit, that they didn't seem to think that there needed to be a shift to private enterprise and a more market system, freedom to be achieved. They also often were skeptical of the West, which they thought was materialistic, didn't have a sense of direction, that the multi-party system was actually decadent. And so it made me think how in the Chinese case you would see in some cases a similarity where even the most enlightened individuals were only enlightened to a certain level, and that they were still loyal to the party and thought the party could be saved and believed that it could be reformed. Nevertheless, in the Chinese case, when you look at like the 08 Charter, they call for a federated republic. They call for the end to the party having a monopoly on power, and they even call for the nationalization of the People's Liberation Army, which makes me wonder whether you were also struck by the timidity in terms of what the dissidents were actually demanding, if not in terms of the bravery they displayed when they pursued it.
Thank you. There's a lot in that question. And I want to begin by just reminding everybody that whatever your position may be about the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and what it did, what it accomplished, what it failed to do, and for that matter, the Communist Party of China, in both cases, many people at the time that the Soviet dissident movement was active were extremely impressed with the success of the Communist Party, in this case in the Soviet Union, in raising that country to the status of a superpower, in rapidly industrializing it, and thereby positioning it to successfully resist the greatest military invasion in all of human history. I mean, of course, Operation Barbarossa, launched in June of 1941 by Adolf Hitler and his general staff. And the prestige of the Soviet Union in the post-war period must not be forgotten. And that applies to the dissidents as well. They were, as I argue in the book, very Soviet people.
And that's different from the Chinese case, where in the 1980s, as they were reflecting about what went wrong, the communists did not defeat the Japanese, and they were not the ones who achieved the first socialist revolution. And so they had a lot less pride in what the party had done between 1949 and 1976.
I'm glad you chose those dates, and I'm going to go out on a limb here because I think subsequent to 1976 and with the reforms under Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese Communist Party presided over something extraordinarily impressive. They lifted 700 million people out of poverty. Now, of course, the party didn't do that by itself, but the party presided over a transformation of Chinese society that I think left a very, very impressive image, and not just in the PRC itself. So it's important not to forget these accomplishments when we try to recreate the mindset of people who, as you pointed out, in the Soviet case, were not interested in dismantling the Soviet system. We're not interested in replacing the Communist Party with another force, least of all with themselves as the new rulers. We have to remember these were intellectuals. Intellectuals generally are more good at thinking in abstract, speculative ways than they are with taking action. And you have to give the Soviet dissidents a lot of credit that they actually were willing to act on their ideas. But they never saw themselves as seeking to capture the state or to topple the state. And I would even go further than that. Like most of their fellow citizens, it was beyond their cognitive ability to imagine that the Soviet Union would collapse in 1991. There's one Soviet dissident. I'm going to mention him because he happens to be my favorite of all. His name is Andrea Malrich, who unfortunately died in a car accident in 1980, who wrote a pamphlet in 1969 called "Will the Soviet Union Survive Until 1984?" When I say wrote a pamphlet, I mean, of course, it was an underground piece that was distributed hand to hand. It could never be published in the Soviet Union. But he's the great exception that almost proves the rule. He could imagine the Soviet system collapsing. He didn't get the causes right, but he got very close to the timing right. But he was an outlier, and almost none of his fellow dissidents thought that that was a realistic scenario. They certainly weren't working towards it. So when you ask about, why didn't they think in terms of replacing the party, and were they naive in a sense in thinking that this system could be reformed? I think within the horizon of what was thinkable at the time, no, I don't think they were naive. I think they were actually extraordinarily creative to realize the potential power inside the idea of the rule of law at a time when nobody took that seriously in the Soviet Union. When they announced this policy of what I call civil obedience, sort of obeying the Soviet law as written to the letter, the black and white letter, and insisting that the government do the same, the most common response to that was, "Are you crazy? Don't you understand that the Soviet government doesn't take its own laws seriously? Why are you pretending that there is or could be the rule of law in this country?" To which their response typically was, "You're the problem. People like you are the problem. If more Soviet citizens did take the current legal system seriously, that would form a very powerful source of leverage against a state that is accustomed to acting capriciously and willfully without having to think about whether it's violating its own laws." That to me is an extraordinarily powerful way of thinking about peaceful change.
I'd like to ask a more meta question about your book. I read a novel a few months ago called Alone in Berlin by Hans Fallada, and it's about this couple who write anti-Nazi pamphlets during World War II, and they put them in apartments, they put them on staircases, and they achieve nothing. No one who reads them and finds them is inspired by them, and when they're arrested, actually everyone who is proximate to them but were totally innocent are punished. And so it's a story of disaster, that the fact that these people tried to do something not only made it better, not only did not make it better, but made it worse, but that Fallada writing about them is making a case that because they existed, it demonstrated that there was still some good in Germany, and that as it moved away from that terrible legacy, they could look to people like that and find faith and hope in them. Which makes me wonder, your book is a case of people who decided that principle, in some cases, was more important than expediency, and that their choices were partly about making a better world, but also about allowing them to live with themselves. Have Russian dissidents read your book since it's come out, and has it inspired them in a way that you think is meaningful?
I want to say yes, but not only Russian dissidents. I think, to be honest, Russians these days are grateful for any book that has anything positive to say about any aspect of their history. And by highlighting these dissidents who, whatever you think of their politics and their methods, were undeniably courageous and stood up for what they believed, I think there is a kind of redemptive message. Because if you're Russian today, whether you live in Russia or you're in exile in, choose your city, Yerevan, Tbilisi, Berlin, Paris, Washington, D.C., you are sort of guilty by association with this just tremendously bad image of a country that is engaging in lethal, aggressive warfare against a much smaller neighbor. So the response among Russians, and in some ways that was the audience that means the most to me for this book, has been kind of grateful, like, thank you for highlighting some good Russians, or some good Soviet citizens. I don't know that there are people who embrace the message that you just described, which is that it's worth sacrificing yourself so that you can live with yourself. It's worth paying the ultimate price so that you can show posterity that there was a moral choice at the time. I haven't read this novel that you just mentioned, but there's a much more famous parallel to it, the group known as the White Rose in Munich in 1938 and 39. These were students at the University of Munich who essentially sacrificed themselves in the same way. They distributed leaflets in one of the courtyards at the University of Munich, and they were eventually caught, tortured, put on trial, and executed. And you could say the same thing. They accomplished nothing. They did nothing to slow down the war machine in Nazi Germany.
But we do remember them.
Not only do we remember them, that square in Munich is now named what is it in English? The Scholl sibling square, and they have a kind of iconic status in post-war West German culture. Of course, if the AfD, the radical right party in Germany, comes to power, that probably will be put an end to. But for half a century, they really had a huge impact on Germans' sense of themselves and what was possible. I think the person who most embodies what you're describing is someone you mentioned earlier, the poet Natalia Gorbanevskaya, who was one of those 8 demonstrators along with her friend Pavel Litvinov in August of 1968 on Red Square.
I thought about that in the Ukraine context, actually, in the sense that those protesters said, we need to show the world that not all Russians support the crackdown in Czechoslovakia. And we have these debates in the United States about how culpable Russia is as a society, and whether no Russians should be allowed to travel to Europe with a visa if they're not opposing the Russian regime. And the people who, as you described, protested, one of the things they wanted to do was sort of say, like, Sodom and Gomorrah, if there are 10 at least, then it says something morally about that society.
I'll leave it to people in the audience to ponder the question of whether Alex Preddy and the other victims of ICE assassinations in Minneapolis will also one day be held up as figures who were willing to put their lives on the line in order to make a point about the limits of state power in Minneapolis. I hope they do.
Well, this is the last question I wanted to ask you, which is, at the beginning of your book, you say that it's about a universal struggle between hopelessness and perseverance in the contemporary world. How much does your book tell us about the world in which we are today, including in our country? And how much of it is about these people dealt with something that people in this room can't even imagine?
Well, I dare say some people in this room probably can imagine, depending on your biographies. But yeah, what I meant by that was that I see certain resources, moral and political resources in this movement, which, if creatively and responsibly transposed to our own situation, I think can become sources of hopefulness. There are enormous contrasts between the Soviet Union circa 1970 and let's say the United States circa 2026. I don't want to minimize those in any way, and I could talk for half an hour about those differences. But here's what I think is really interesting. There are 3 things. One of them is psychic, and the other 2 are structural. I do think that the hurdles that were faced by Soviet dissidents, both objective and subjective in their minds, were considerably greater and more intimidating than what we face today. We still have institutional structures in this country that are capable of forming resistance and bulwarks against an executive authority that is threatening to run amok, to run out of control. And when you step back from the dissident movement and ask, what were their techniques? This is a tiny number of people. It's a drop in the ocean of the Soviet population. How did they manage to become so visible and to exercise so much influence, at least over the international conversation, and I would argue over much more internally inside the Soviet Union? There are basically 2 answers. They didn't have a free press, so they made one. They just made it's a classic DIY situation. They didn't have one, so they made their own free press in the form of typewriters, onion skin paper, carbon paper, networks of distribution of underground typed texts from hand to hand to hand. We do have a free press, although it's in jeopardy. But I think the dividends that the dissidents managed to extract from their very primitive, homegrown press are remarkable. I mean, they really broke the monopoly on information of the Soviet state, and the Soviet state never recovered that monopoly. The second thing is that there was no independent judiciary in the Soviet Union, not even in theory, much less in practice. It was never designed to be a system based on checks and balances. It was a unitary state in which the efficacy of government was promoted by having the judiciary be subservient to the executive. So the deck was stacked against the dissidents in the judicial realm from the beginning. There was also no such thing as judicial review. No court in the Soviet Union was authorized to declare that a given law was anti-constitutional. That was simply not part of their domain. They couldn't do it. So that's a pretty hopeless situation. And yet the dissidents managed to turn trial after trial, even when the defendants were found guilty, which they were 99% of the time. They managed to lose the juridical case, but win the public relations case. They turned what, by any standard of judgment, was a hostile judiciary into an instrument for propagating their own ideas, not only to their fellow citizens, but to the world. That's really remarkable. I have a friend here from college with whom I studied briefly the martial art Aikido. And I like to compare the dissident strategy to that technique, because Aikido is not about, it's not like Taekwondo or karate where you're learning how to punch and hit and go for the weak spots in your opponent. Aikido is about using your opponent's own weight against him or her. So you can be smaller and weaker than your opponent, but if you can manipulate their center of gravity, their own weight becomes an enemy to them, a liability to them. The Soviet dissidents used the Soviet judiciary against the state itself. I don't think anybody would have predicted that that was possible. And then there's finally the psychic element. Here I think the challenge of applying it to the United States today is much more difficult because the American mindset is so different from the Russian/Soviet. The title of my book, To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause, is, I certainly didn't make that up. That's a dissident toast that was pronounced with shot glasses in hand over many, many different kitchen tables in Moscow, Kiev, and Leningrad, and other Soviet cities. And that ironic combination of success and hopelessness captures, for me, more efficiently and more pungently any other characterization of the mindset of this movement. And it was a mindset that managed to combine genuine despair over the prospects of the movement with a refusal to give up hope. Now, Americans don't do despair, right? We don't do tragedy, certainly not in public. I mean, there are lots of private tragedies, but we really don't do public tragedies. The Russians do, for historical reasons, which I'm sure you're aware of. So I don't know that Americans can really learn from this blend of boldness and despair in the same person, in the same heart. But it wouldn't be a bad idea if we did. Because when I listen to friends of mine saying, oh God, things are getting terrible, I'm going to move to Canada. You know, I'm like, no, you're not. You're going to stay here and you're going to fight. Because that's what we're supposed to do in this kind of system. I get inspiration from Soviet dissidents because of that blend of boldness and despair. They didn't deny the horrible odds of them achieving anything. They didn't deny it. They lived with it, and they managed to combine with it a certain stamina and determination. I find that very impressive.
To the success of our hopeful cause, maybe.
Thank you.
I just have two questions I want to ask. One is about, many of the dissidents are exiled overseas, right? So how would they organize?
So the first part of the question is about those who were forced to leave the country. Some were literally deported, you know, put on planes and stripped of their citizenship. Others were given very unpalatable alternatives, like you can leave in 3 days or we'll put you in prison. So technically it's a voluntary emigration, but of course it's not really voluntary. And yes, about half of the activists in the movement, that's my calculation, by the year 1980, about half of them had been forced out of the country. Many of them attempted to maintain some kind of relevance to the situation in the Soviet Union, and I don't think I need to explain to this audience how difficult that is to do from outside the country. The minute you cross the border of your country, you lose 90% of your visibility and your impact. They did have a few things in their favor. One of them was that many of the Western countries sponsored shortwave radio stations which beamed programs back into the Soviet Union. And in the case of the BBC and the Voice of America and others, many of the staff members of those radio programs were former dissidents. So they, in a sense, had a very powerful megaphone at their disposal. Still, inside the country, people who broadcast a given message from the safety of New York or London just don't have the same impact as people who are doing it right next door, you know, whether it's in Moscow or Leningrad or Irkutsk or what have you. So being part of the exile community was very difficult for most dissidents. The other technique they had was to print dissident texts in Russian and then smuggle them back into the Soviet Union. Tamizdat. So samizdat means I published it myself, and tamizdat means I published it over there. The most famous of these was a press called Chronica that was set up in New York by exiled physicist Valery Chalidze. And he managed to smuggle a lot of books back into the Soviet Union. You will not be shocked to learn that the CIA helped him do that. They helped multiply the number of books and they helped get them back in.
What do we make of Roy Medvedev? He essentially thinks that everything that was wrong with the Soviet Union was Stalin's fault, and that if we resurrect Lenin, everything will be fine, which is a very strange form of dissent. But on the other hand, he was courageous enough to publish his book, Let History Judge, in samizdat and abroad, which is very rare among pro-Lenin people. So what do we make of this kind of contradiction in one person?
So for those of you who, for whom Roy Medvedev is not a concept, he was one of two twins, Roy and Joris Medvedev, whose father was sucked into the vortex of punishment and execution in the 1930s under Stalin, and they both became what I would call social democratic dissidents. That is, dissidents who thought that the solution to the Soviet predicament was to return to the ideals of Leninism. It's funny you should describe him as sort of odd man out or a kind of paradox, because until the 1960s and until the rule of law cohort of this movement became the dominant force, Medvedev's position was actually the most popular. This is the opening to one of the chapters in the book. Up until the 1960s, Marxism-Leninism as a body of thought and as a set of practices and as a lineage was the single greatest source of inspiration for opposition to the Soviet state. And it makes a certain sense because Medvedev, like everybody in his generation, was schooled on Marxism-Leninism, was schooled on the romantic revolutionary mission of the Bolshevik Party. So it, in a sense, is not surprising that they would have adopted the position that Stalin and his government had derailed and corrupted the revolution, and that if the Soviet Union could only sort of backtrack and recover the promise of 1917, they could get things right again. That was, in some ways, the orthodox position among opponents to the regime. And there were many underground groups, some of them very small, some of them very ephemeral, but nonetheless enough to attract the attention of the KGB, that described themselves as, judging by their names, the Union for the Resurrection of Leninism, or the Revolutionary Underground Party for the Return to Marxist-Leninist Ideals. I mean, these names sound like caricatures, but they're not. So Medvedev is interesting not only because he represented that current, but as you say, he was brave enough to write a history of Stalinism called Let History Judge, is the English translation, which became enormously influential. He was the first one to offer a homegrown interpretation of Stalinism. Most people cite it but don't read it. It's a very thoughtful history. And he wasn't even a professional historian. He was a professor of education in Moscow. But he talked to people, he interviewed people who had survived Stalin's purges, and he put together, it's not perfect, but it's a very powerful explanation. And unlike Khrushchev, who, when he denounced Stalin in the so-called secret speech in February of 1956, and attributed everything to Stalin and Stalin's paranoia, and didn't mention the tens of thousands of other people that are, of course, necessary when you send 18 million grown-ups to the Gulag. I mean, one man just can't do that, even Stalin. Unlike Khrushchev, Medvedev was not satisfied with personalist explanations. He didn't attempt to put all the blame on Stalin. He understood that something structural had gone wrong. So he is a force to be reckoned with. I could have paid more attention to him in my book, but as some of you may have noticed, it's a little on the long side, and I didn't want to make it even longer than it already is, but I'm glad that you brought him up.
I cite Roy Medvedev in my biography of Xi Jinping's father Medvedev says that anyone who existed within the Soviet system at any level of leadership inevitably had to hurt people around him or her to survive. And so, drawing upon what you just said, a structural argument that it's not a story of good guys and bad guys. Everyone mixed, being victims, but also were perpetrators at the same time. And by the way, Xi Jinping, one of the very first things he did after he came to power was arrest Marxist students for working with unions. And they were also believing that they could get back to Marxist roots.
Did you have access to the KGB files? How easy was it to work with them? Is there stuff that's left out from there? Tell us about that.
Yes, I did have access, but probably not in the way you might imagine. I never got permission to work in the KGB archive in Moscow, which of course is the motherlode. Yes, some Russian historians have gotten permission to work there, but under extremely restrictive conditions. So no laptops, no cell phones. You can't take images of any documents. You can go in there with a pencil and paper, and of course they check everything when you're leaving. I did not get that far, but here's what I did get. I got a couple of dissidents or their descendants to grant me power of attorney so that I could request their dossiers. And there's a law in Russia, I don't know whether it's still active, but when I was doing research for this book, there was a law that any Soviet citizen, former Soviet citizen, had the right to request a copy of their KGB dossier. A number of dissidents did this. Andrei Sakharov's widow did it for him. Andrei Sinyavsky, the writer who was put on trial in 1965, did it. I don't think the KGB released everything in their dossiers. I'm sure they kept a few things for their own reading pleasure, but they released a lot, and some of those collections made their way to archives outside of the Soviet Union. So the Hoover Archive at Stanford has the complete, or more or less complete, KGB dossier of Andrei Sinyavsky. The Houghton Library, the manuscript division of the Houghton Library at Harvard, has Sakharov's dossier, Yelena Bonner's dossier, the dossier of Andrei Amalrik. These were sort of back doors into the building that I was not allowed to get into in the front door. But what really blew things open is that when the Soviet Union collapsed and a single federative country split up into 15 separate republics, each of those republics had a branch of the KGB. And each of those KGB branches had an archive. So I made a beeline to Lithuania, to Vilnius, and I started working in the archive of the former Lithuanian branch of the KGB. And lo and behold, even though I wasn't particularly interested in Lithuania, although it's part of the story, small part of the story, turns out that Moscow, as all bureaucracies do, sent lots and lots of memoranda from the center to the peripheries. Another backdoor into the collection that I was not able to work with directly, but the materials in Lithuania are unbelievable. I mean, this was an historian's dream to have access to this kind of stuff. In particular, there was a famous trial in Vilnius in 1975 involving a Moscow activist. They moved it to Vilnius so that the Western press wouldn't be able to cover it. But in order to have the trial in Vilnius, they had to ship all of the investigatory materials from Moscow. And it was just interrogation transcript after interrogation transcript, 30 volumes of investigative material for this one trial. So I was like a kid in a candy store working in that archive. And just as the folks in Moscow had put every roadblock in my way that they could, the people in Vilnius were like, come on in. Please show us as much dirt as you can about what the Soviet Union did to its people. So it was the exact opposite reception story, greatly to my benefit, needless to say.
Were there a lot of mistrust among the dissident movement? I mean, obviously it was not just one movement, but it also had all the, but were people ever worried about black ops like infiltrating their movement?
Yes, there was pretty much constant fear of KGB moles being planted. And the way they overcame that fear, which as you can imagine could have been paralyzing and could have destroyed the movement by eroding whatever trust there was among its members, the way they overcame it was to conduct their business transparently, to not have secrets. So they eliminated the danger of informing by simply being open about what they did. And they could afford to be open because they only did things that were legal. Of course, that didn't prevent them from occasionally getting punished anyway, But it was, I think, a very clever way of overcoming their own fear of being exposed. Of course, there were things that had to be kept on the down low. I mean, you didn't want to broadcast the location in which samizdat was being produced. You didn't want to open the door or open the window to some of the intramural conflicts that were going on inside the movement. And one of the most dramatic differences in Soviet dissident memoirs published before 1991 from those published after is that the ones published before 1991, when there was still a KGB and reasons to be afraid of retribution by the Soviet state, they do not discuss internal arguments. They maintain the fiction of unity and complete trust within the movement. After the collapse, people start pulling up the curtain a little bit on those conflicts. And part of what I try to do in the book is to illustrate not just the drama of the movements contending with the Soviet state, but the inner drama inside the movement of different factions with different ideas about how to behave and what the best strategy was.
Soviet dissidents often framed their resistance under universal moral or legal terms, such as human rights, constitutionalism. In contrast, Chinese dissent today sometimes appears more fragmented: labor, feminist, religious, ethnic, legal activism. Is this fragmentation a weakness, or could it represent a more different, even more resilient model of dissent?
So let me begin by saying that the Soviet dissident movement began as a civil rights movement, invoking Soviet laws and Soviet civil liberties that were enshrined in the Constitution. Only when that source of traction failed to produce the results that they were looking for did they gradually shift their vocabulary and their point of reference to international human rights law and human rights norms. So it's an important distinction because the original approach was not universal. It was a very Soviet context and a Soviet language that they were attempting to deploy. The question of feminist dissent and labor-based dissent, or dissent on behalf of the disabled, or in the Soviet case on behalf of national minorities or religious believers, all of those currents were present parallel to the more rights-based, either Soviet or universal human rights-based movement. And there was a very complicated relationship. On the one hand, the so-called rights defenders, the people who were invoking the Soviet Constitution and then later the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, they wanted to serve as a kind of umbrella for all the other movements. They wanted to provide them with a vocabulary that they could use on behalf of their own cause. On the other hand, some of those smaller movements felt that their particular cause was being treated as a second-tier issue. The argument being, let's secure fundamental civil liberties, procedural things like free speech, freedom of assembly, free press, and then we can deal with your particularist needs, whether you're Jews or women or Ukrainians or what have you. That, of course, did not go over well with these movements. They did not want to be told to take a back seat, contribute to our movement first, and then we'll deal with yours. The other problem was that while, and we discussed this briefly, while the rights defenders had no aspiration to capture the state or to topple the state or to engage in regime change, quite a few of the Ukrainian dissidents, their ultimate goal was secession of Ukraine from the Soviet Union. Same is true even more so of the Lithuanian dissidents. There was an uneasy relationship because those ultimate goals were not really compatible. And the solution to that tension was usually just to not talk about it, to find, which is what opposition movements have to do. They have to find common ground and kind of not talk too much about the tensions and sort of get their common mission accomplished. And that's essentially what happened in the case of the Soviet dissident movement. The final twist in this story is that numerically, many of those so-called second-tier movements, including those of religious believers or Crimean Tatars seeking the permission to return to their homeland in the Crimean Peninsula, or Ukrainians, they vastly outnumbered the rights defenders. I mean like 100 to 1, easily. Even the Jewish movement numerically the Jewish movement to emigrate from the Soviet Union was much larger than the rights defenders proper.
And also these Russian nationalists, too, many who were overseas and had diaspora publications that were anti-Soviet.
Yes, although the Russian nationalist movement was not nearly as articulate and well-formed as the non-Russian national movements. The numerical asymmetry is something that, I probably should have paid more attention to in the book. And one of the most frequent criticisms of the book is that it's too centered on the Moscow cohort. But those are the people who had access to Western journalists. Those are the people who could summon the attention of the world and get their texts read on the shortwave radio broadcast. So I think they numerically had an outsized impact on the Soviet Union, despite their relatively small numbers.
This was amazing. Thank you so much for that. And a big thank you to Dr.
Thank you.